On 1 March 1943, a strong reinforcement convoy for Lae, about 7,000 troops in 8 transports and as many destroyers, departed Rabaul. By this time, Major General George C. Kenny, Air Commander under MacArthur, had beefed up his own and the Royal Australian Air Force in Papua to 207 bombers and 129 fighters. He had equipped 1 squadron of B-25s with 500-pound bombs, having a 5-second delay fuse that permitted a plane to come in on a ship almost at sea level, like a torpedo bomber, drop its bomb and escape. The Lae-bound convoy was kept under observation, and at 10 a.m. March 3, the land-based Allied planes flew in to bomb it from over Papua. The ensuing battle was the most devastating air attack on ships of the entire war, excepting only that on Pearl Harbor. Out of 37 bombs dropped by the first wave of planes, 23 scored, and by noon over 200 bombs had fallen upon and around the writhing ships. High above sea level, Army Air Force fighters tangled with the Japanese combat air patrol. Others flew to Lae to prevent air reinforcement reaching the enemy. All afternoon the slaughter continued. 7 out of 8 transports and 2 of the 8 destroyers were sunk. 4 undamaged destroyers picked up survivors and fled. The sea was spotted with life rafts, rubber boats and swimmers. At daybreak, 4 March, the Army Air Force returned and sank 2 damaged destroyers. Now the motor torpedo boats took a hand. PT-143 and PT-150, after sinking the 1 transport still afloat, encountered a Japanese submarine taking on survivors from 3 big landing craft. The I-boat dived, the PTs sank the craft and machine-gunned the survivors. This may sound horrible, but it had to be done, as Japanese soldiers and sailors were trained to resist capture, or, if captured willy-nilly, to seek revenge on their saviours. There were innumerable incidents such as a wounded Japanese soldier at Guadalcanal, seizing a scalpel and burying it in the back of a surgeon who was about to save his life by an operation, and a survivor of the Battle of Vella Lavella, rescued by PT-163, pulling a gun and killing a bluejacket in the act of giving the Japanese sailor a cup of coffee. The total score of this Battle of the Bismarck Sea was 8 Japanese transports and 4 destroyers sunk, and 3,000 to 4,000 men killed. This at a cost of 2 bombers and 3 fighters out of over 300 aircraft engaged. Unfortunately, this smashing victory could never be repeated, because the Japanese never again risked a transport bigger than a barge in waters shadowed by American planes. During this long lull in major operations, Japan was improving her defensive positions at Huon Gulf and westward in New Guinea, and in the Central and Upper Solomons. Munda airfield on New Georgia was greatly extended. A supporting field was established at Vila on Kolombangara. Seaplane bases were set up at Shortlands and Santa Isabel. New airfields were built on Balalay near Shortlands and Kahiki on southern Bougainville. South Pacific cruiser task groups under Rear Admirals A. Stanton Merrill and Walden L. Ainsworth raided these places frequently. Tip Merrill sank 2 enemy destroyers incidental to bombarding Vila on the night of 5 to 6 March. Airsols bombed them even more often, but the Japanese kept right on working. And Fleet Admiral Yamamoto was preparing a big campaign, which proved to be his last. This Y operation, as he called it, was meant to be a crushing, annihilating air offensive from Rabaul against American ships and bases in Papua and the Solomons. To double the already strong air fleet at Rabaul, Admiral Ozawa contributed some 170 naval planes from 4 carriers. No fewer than 187 planes pulled off the first strike of eye operation against Tulagi on 7 April. There was a wild scene in Tulagi harbour when the bombers roared in. They sank a tanker, a New Zealand corvette and destroyer Aaron Ward, losing only 21 of their own planes. On 11 to 12 April, Yamamoto threw the eye switch to Papua, burned 2 merchant vessels at Oro Bay, and sent 174 aircraft over the Owen Stanley Range to attack Port Moresby. MacArthur's anti-aircraft guns prevented them from doing much damage. Small result for all this effort, but Yamamoto never learned the truth. By decrypting Japanese communications, Halsey obtained the complete timetable of a forthcoming inspection tour by the Japanese commander-in-chief, and both Nimitz and King encouraged him to profit thereby. 16 United States Army Lightnings flew up from Henderson Field to intercept Yamamoto's air cortege and neatly shot down the 2 bombers carrying the fleet admiral and staff, killing him and 5 or 6 others. All Japanese writers admit that this was equivalent to a major defeat, since there was only one Yamamoto. Everyone in the now crowded American bases at Noumea, Espiritu Santo, Guadalcanal, Tulagi and Purvis Bay was asking, "When do we go?" Halsey was ready to start the South Pacific ball rolling in mid-April, but General MacArthur was not. He knew very well that military power is like a 3-legged stool. If it lacks one of the 3 legs, land power, air power and sea power, it will be toppled. In 1942, MacArthur was sitting on one leg, land power. A second leg, air power, proved its strength in the Battle of the Bismarck Sea, and on 15 March a third leg, 7th Fleet under Vice Admiral Arthur S. Carpenter, was set up. But being at the end of the line, this was the last fleet to get beaching and landing craft and other instruments to enable Rear Admiral Daniel E. Barbie and his new 7th Amphibious Force to go places. Everything in the South Pacific was held up until General MacArthur's third leg, the Amphibious Force, was ready. A Joint Chief of Staff directive of 29 March set Southwest Pacific 2 tasks. First, to establish airfields on the Trobriand Islands. Second, to seize Japanese positions on Huon Gulf and along Vitiaz Strait, and Cape Gloucester on New Britain, in order to breach the Bismarck barrier at vital points. MacArthur chose the last day of June to start. It was a walkover, since Kirrawina and Woodlark, the 2 Trobriands, were occupied only by natives. But this was the first time in the Southwest Pacific that air, land and sea power had operated as a balanced team, and Barbie's plan for the Trobriands became the template for all later shore-to-shore leaps along the New Guinea coast. Before the war ended, 7th Fib would have over 50 amphibious landings to its credit, and its commander would be known as Uncle Dan, the amphibious man. Nassau Bay was occupied the same day, 30 June, by a shore-to-shore operation. General Eichelberger's troops were lifted 40 miles from Morobe in motor torpedo boats and in landing craft manned by the 2nd Engineer Special Brigade, all riding the crest of a southeast gale. There was jubilation in the South Pacific when the word go was finally pronounced in the picturesque Melanesian pidgin, "Musket he fire up." Munda on New Georgia, the annoying airbase whence the Japanese raided Guadalcanal and Tulagi for months after they had been secured, was the objective. The amphibious forces, under Rear Admiral R. Kelly Turner in Macaulay, comprised 10 large transports, 12 destroyer transports, 9 landing ship tank, and 11 landing craft infantry, screened by 8 destroyers and supported by battleships, cruisers and escort carriers under Rear Admirals Ainsworth, Merrill and Glenn B. Davis. The major landing took place on Rendova Island across Blanche Channel from Munda. Troops had to be ferried thence to the New Georgia shore, and then fight Japanese step by step through the jungle to get at the coveted airdrome. The naval part of this campaign for Munda was sparked off by hot clashes up the slot between Japanese Tokyo expresses to Vila, whence troops were transferred to Munda, and Rear Admiral Walden L. Ainsworth's light cruiser task force. On the night of 4 to 5 July, it bombarded Vila and Bairoko, but lost destroyer strong Commander J. H. Wellings to a mine. The following night, ordered back up the slot by Halsey, Ainsworth fought the Battle of Kula Gulf against a 10-destroyer force under Rear Admiral Akiyama. American gunfire sank one destroyer and drove another ashore, but cruiser Helena was sunk by 3 explosions of the Japanese long-lance torpedoes. On the night of 12 and 13 July, Ainsworth performed his 15th combat mission up the slot, and enjoyed another fight, the Battle of Kolombangara, in almost the same water as that of Kula Gulf. He had light cruisers Honolulu, Captain Robert W. Haler, and St. Louis, Captain Colin Campbell, with His Majesty's New Zealand ship Leander, Captain C. A. L. Manserg, sister ship to the famous His Majesty's ship Achilles, to replace lost Helena, and 2 destroyer squadrons of 5 ships each. This time he tangled with Rear Admiral Izaki's support group, comprising Tanaka's old flagship Jintsu, 5 destroyers and 4 destroyer transports. Although we had radar and the enemy none, he had a radar-detecting device which enabled him to track Ainsworth's progress up the slot for an hour, before American radar bounced off a Japanese ship. Izaki launched torpedoes at 1:08 a.m. July 13, 1 minute before Captain McInerney's van destroyer squadron got off theirs. Ainsworth then waited until range closed to 10,000 yards before ordering his cruisers to commence firing. As usual in early days of radar fire control, the cruisers concentrated on the biggest blip, Jintsu, and so smothered her with 6-inch shell that she exploded and went down with all hands. A few minutes earlier, a Japanese torpedo crashed into Leander, putting her out of the battle and almost out of the war. While 2 destroyers stood by Leander, Ainsworth sent McInerney's destroyer squadron scampering up the slot in the hope of catching the retiring Japanese destroyers, and followed with his remaining 2 cruisers and 3 destroyers. This bold bid for complete victory was thrown back in his face. The 5 Japanese destroyers, reloading torpedo tubes under cover of a rain squall in the remarkably fast time of 18 minutes, countermarched, and at 1:56 a.m. appeared on the American cruisers' radar scopes. Ainsworth hesitated to open gunfire, fearing lest the blips represented McInerney's destroyers returning. I was in flag plot with him, seeing and feeling the agony of decision in such a case. And when at 2:05 a.m. the Admiral ordered right turn to unmask his main batteries and commence firing, it was too late. The Japanese destroyers had already launched their 31 torpedo reload and were speeding away. 1 long lance sank destroyer Gwyn, 1 caught Honolulu and 1 exploded on St. Louis, each so far forward as to lull nobody and do but slight damage. A third, which hit the flagship square in her fantail without exploding, hung there a moment and then dropped out. Although we who participated in these battles up the slot felt pretty cocky at the time, thinking we had sunk at least 12 ships in the 2 actions, sober reassessment indicates that we were not so hot. The Japanese were still tops in torpedo work and night fighting. Incredible as it now seems, the speed, size and range of the Japanese long-lance torpedo, invented 10 years earlier and lavishly employed in every naval action of the war, was still unknown to the Pacific Fleet. One had been salvaged early in 1943 and analysed by the Bureau of Ordnance, but these findings had not even reached Admiral Halsey. Had Ainsworth been apprised of its capacity, he would never have closed to 10,000 yards before opening gunfire, or manoeuvred his cruisers in enemy torpedo water. As it was, he enjoyed good luck in bringing all 3 cruisers back to Tulagi on their own bottoms. The Japanese continued to lose planes and ships, which they could not replace, to save Munda and Vella. Then they continued to lose more planes, ships and men, to get men out of Munda and Vella. Reinforcement and evacuation were very well done, but a string of such victories adds up to defeat. The land campaign for Munda went very slowly. It was the worst kind of jungle fighting. Too many of our troops were raw, and their top commander, until relieved by Major General Oscar W. Griswold, was unequal to the task. It took nearly 34,000 American troops 6 weeks to wrest this corner of New Georgia from about 8,000 Japanese. Subsequent to the 2 cruiser actions, the principal naval aid to the New Georgia campaign was contributed by PT boats. They successfully broke up reinforcements by Japanese Daihatsu armed barges on the nights of 23 to 24 and 26-27 July. Another action, unsuccessful in a military sense, but important to a future President of the United States, took place on the night of 1 to 2 August 1943. 15 PTs, divided 4 ways, tried to block Blackett Strait south of Kolombangara to a Japanese destroyer express. They used torpedoes lavishly, but made not one hit on enemy ships going or coming. On the contrary, Commander Hanami of destroyer Amagiri had the distinction of running down and knifing in 2 PT-109, commanded by Lieutenant John F. Kennedy. 11 of the crew of 13 survived, and with Kennedy swimming and towing a wounded sailor, and the rest on an improvised raft, they managed to reach a small island in 5 hours. Kennedy refused to give up. He spent most of the next night swimming in the strait, hoping in vain to intercept a PT. In the morning he sent a message on a coconut shell via a friendly native to an Australian coast watcher who dispatched other natives to the rescue. Kennedy and his surviving shipmates were paddled to safety in a well-camouflaged canoe. The capture of Munda on 5 August did not end the naval campaign up the slot, For a full year, destroyer officers had been banging fists on wardroom tables and bellowing, "When are they going to cut us loose from the cruiser's apron strings?" In one battle after another, the officer in tactical command had kept destroyers in van and rear, instead of sending them to make independent torpedo attacks, and the performance of American torpedoes so far had been miserable. "But just give us a chance," was the destroyer sailors' reply to every criticism. Now, Rear Admiral Theodore S. Wilkinson, who had relieved Kelly Turner as Com. 3rd Fib, accepted this challenge from Commander Frederick Moosbrugger, who met it admirably. The chance occurred because Wilkinson suspected on 5 August that the Japanese would run a Tokyo Express to Kolombangara the following night, and Wilkinson told Moosbrugger to fight the battle his own way. With 6 destroyers, Dunlap, Craven, Maury, Lang, Sterritt, Stack, the last 2 under Commander Roger Simpson, Moosbrugger gave battle in Vella Gulf on the night of 6 to 7 August to 4 Japanese destroyers under Captain Sugiura. He surprised them with a flock of torpedoes at a range of 4,000 yards, and 3 of the enemy destroyers exploded with such a flash and roar that sailors on PT boats almost 30 miles away thought that the volcano on Kolombangara had blown its top. There was a brief exchange of gunfire after this initial hit, and Lucky Shigure, the one that escaped, fired torpedoes, but no Japanese ship laid a finger on Moosbrugger. His Battle of Vella Gulf was one of the neatest victories of the war. July of 1943 was a month of Allied victory in Sicily, on the Russian front, and in the Atlantic sea lanes. Japanese resistance at Munda, threatening to slow up the Pacific War, led to a notable acceleration in tactics. So far, MacArthur's strategy in New Guinea, like Halsey's in the Solomons, could not unfairly be described as island hopping. If we had continued at that pace, it would have taken at least 10 years to reach Japan, and the enemy's strategy of tiring us out by sheer stubbornness might have worked. But about this time, leapfrogging was substituted for island hopping. General Tojo, shortly before his death, told General MacArthur that leapfrogging was one of the 3 principal factors that defeated Japan, the other 2 being the depredations of United States submarines and the ability of fast carrier forces to operate for long periods away from their bases. There was nothing new about leapfrogging or bypassing enemy strongpoints, or, as General MacArthur and Admiral Wilkinson called it in baseball phraseology, hitting them where they ain't. Wilkinson, a student of naval strategy, had long been eager to take advantage of Pacific topography, bypass the strongest Japanese garrisons, seal them off by air and sea, and leave them to wither on the vine. So were General MacArthur's staff. Captain Harry R. Thurber of Halsey's staff advocated the bypassing of Munda early in 1943, but we had to take it instead, because there was then no place to leapfrog into. The first demonstration of leapfrogging came about inadvertently in the Aleutians. Admiral Nimitz skipped over Kiska to take the more important Attu, and the enemy then secretly evacuated Kiska. Nimitz on 11 July 1943 suggested to Halsey that Kolombangara be given the Kiska treatment, land troops on Vella Lavella to the northwest, and skip the island with the long name. A plan was promptly drafted to place Villa Airfield under the fire of American artillery to sever the enemy's supply lines to Kolombangara and seize lightly held Vella Lavella for a fighter plane base. The Vella Lavella landings on 15 August at Barracoma Bay on the eastern foot of the island were uncontested except from the air. During 2 weeks after the landings, Wilkinson's 3rd Fib delivered 6,305 men and 8,626 tons cargo on the island, fought off Japanese planes in scores of air attacks, and turned back 1 enemy reinforcement echelon. Land operations continued slowly but systematically. On 18 September, the American troops were relieved by the 3rd Division New Zealand Army, Major General Barrowclough. The New Zealanders pushed a pincer movement up both coasts, and by 1 October had cornered about 600 of the enemy on the northwest shore. There they stayed for another week, when the effort to evacuate them brought about the naval battle of Vella Lavella. This battle occurred because the Japanese endeavoured to evacuate the 600 waifs and strays left on that island. Rear Admiral Ijuin marshalled 9 destroyers and a dozen small craft to rescue them on the night of 6 to 7 October. Admiral Wilkinson sent Captain Frank R. Walker in command of 6 destroyers to intercept. Each side had a destroyer with a charmed life, Shigure, which had escaped Moosbrugger's slaughter at Vella Gulf, and which would be the sole survivor of the Battle of Surigao Strait, and O'Bannon, which probably acquired more hash marks than any destroyer of the United States Navy. In the ensuing Battle of Vella Lavella, on the night of 6 to 7 October, Walker won both the tactical manoeuvring and the draw, launching torpedoes at 10:55 p.m., range 7,000 yards, one of which disemboweled Yagumo, but a torpedo from that very destroyer had already exploded in Chevalier's forward magazine, tearing off her bow as far aft as the bridge, and dooming her, besides causing a collision with O'Bannon which put that destroyer out of the battle. In the meantime, the other 2 Japanese destroyers had registered on Captain Walker's radar screen. After them, he galloped full cry in his now lone Selfridge. The range, over 10,000 yards, was too great for the sluggish products of the Newport torpedo station, but not for the Japanese long lances, 16 of which at 11:06 p.m. were boiling viciously around Selfridge. One caught her forward, exploded, and she shuddered to a stop. Eventually she had to be scuttled. A Japanese plane sighted in the moonlight 3 destroyers dashing up to help Walker, and passed the word to Admiral Juin. That cautious commander then ordered retirement, and the 3 destroyers arrived a quarter hour too late to engage. In the meantime, the sub-chasers which Juin sent to rescue the Vella Lavella garrison quietly embarked them and got out. Thus Juin performed his mission and inflicted the greater damage, but Captain Walker showed skill and guts in accepting the short end of 3-to-1 odds and depriving the Japanese Navy of 1 more destroyer. It had now lost more than 40 by enemy action since the beginning of the war. This battle concluded the Central Solomons campaign, second phase of Operation Watchtower. It had cost the United States Navy 6 warships, and the Imperial Japanese Navy 17. It had brought us 250 miles nearer Rabaul, but 3 months was too much time to spend on getting less than 1/10 of the way to Tokyo. Nevertheless, the Allies now had the strategic initiative. They would call the tunes, selecting where and when to fight. The next hop toward Rabaul from the South Pacific was to Bougainville. This operation was planned by the staffs of Rear Admiral Theodore S. Wilkinson and Lieutenant General Vandergrift, the last 2 at Guadalcanal. Ping Wilkinson, a scholarly officer with an excellent combat record, went into Bougainville as if he had been preparing for it all his life. He had, in fact, won a school prize some 40 years earlier, with an account of an amphibious operation by Alexander the Great. Empress Augusta Bay, near the centre of the long southwest coast of Bougainville, was chosen as target for this big leap. It was near enough Rabaul to be a good base for fighters to join bomber strikes from Munda, and separated from the Japanese garrisons on Bougainville by many miles of dense tropical rainforest. Thus, our troops would have time to dig in and build airstrips before sustaining any serious counterattack by land. Admiral Koga, Yamamoto's successor, guessing that something was coming up, sliced off 173 aircraft from his 3 biggest carriers to help defend Rabaul. Between 12 October and 2 November, the Southwest Pacific Air Forces under General Kenny attempted to knock out Rabaul with 8 massive raids of 54 to 349 planes each. Rabaul survived this treatment, but Kenny's raids were useful in diverting Japanese attention from Bougainville. Although the Gilbert Islands operation was being mounted simultaneously in the Central Pacific, Admiral Wilkinson had enough transports and supporting warships for the task at hand. For ground forces, he had a superb outfit, the 1st Marine Amphibious Corps commanded by General Roy S. Geiger, comprising the 3rd Marine Division, the 37th Infantry Division United States Army, and a brigade group of New Zealand troops. Equally diverse was Air Sols, comprising aircraft of the United States Army, Navy, Marine Corps, and the Royal New Zealanders, the command rotating monthly between officers of the first 3. The landing at Cape Torokina, Empress Augusta Bay, of 14,000 Marines and 6,200 tons of supplies from 12 transports, was pulled off successfully, 1 November 1943. Wilkinson was not bothered by the local defence force, which consisted of 270 Japanese troops and 1 ancient Swaijante Kinse. But, remembering what happened when enemy planes from Rabaul attacked transports at Guadalcanal on 7 to 8 August 1942, he insisted on combat loading his transports so that first things came out first, making for a quick landing and an even quicker getaway. How right he was. The first boat wave hit the beach at 7:26 a.m. The first counter-attack from Rabaul came in at 7:35 a.m. Air cover from Vella Lavella and Munda took care of that, but about more Japanese aircraft attacked at 1 p.m. They were frustrated by 34 savagely aggressive air Sols fighters, which were beautifully handled by a fighter director team in destroyer Conway. In spite of these two interruptions, which forced the big transports to get underway, all but 4 were completely unloaded by 5:30 p.m. and departed, a record performance. Successful as the landings were, everyone expected the Japanese Navy to attempt another Savo Island, and they had not long to wait. Rear Admiral Omori, who hoped to repeat Mikawa's exploit, was given like him a pickup task group to break up the landings. He had his own heavy cruiser division, Miyoko and Haguro, 2 destroyer divisions, one commanded by Rear Admiral Ijuin, the victor at Vella Lavella, 2 light cruisers and 6 destroyers, including indestructible Shigure. Omori was steaming hell-bent to get the American transports in Empress Augusta Bay when he was intercepted by Rear Admiral Merrill's Task Force 39, 4 light cruisers, Montpelier, Cleveland, Columbia, Denver, and 2 destroyer divisions of 4 ships each, one under Commander B.L. Austin and the other commanded by Captain Arlie A. Burke, who had just won the nickname 31 Knot Burke for fast-stepping on a recent bombardment mission. Tip Merrill certainly had plenty of talent under him. The situation was now similar to that before the Battle of Savo Island, with one important difference. From scout planes, the Americans had accurate knowledge of Japanese movements. Merrill's battle plan was to maintain the cruisers in a position across the entrance to Empress Augusta Bay and to prevent the entry therein of a single enemy ship. He proposed to push the enemy westward in order to gain sea room and to fight at ranges close to the maximum effective range of Japanese torpedoes, say 16,000 to 20,000 yards, in order to protect his cruisers from the fate of Helena and Leander. He planned to detach his destroyer divisions for an initial torpedo attack, to hold cruisers' gunfire until the fish struck home, and to give his destroyer commanders complete freedom of action once they were detached. Omori was in cruising disposition, in 3 columns 5,000 yards apart. Juin's destroyers on the left, the 2 heavies in the centre, other destroyers on the right. Some of the Japanese ships had radar, but the operators were green, and Omori relied wholly on visual sighting. This time Japanese eyes and binoculars were not equal to American radar. The manoeuvring in this Battle of Empress Augusta Bay was complicated. Actually, there were 3 battles, one waged by Merrill's cruisers against the enemy cruisers, one by Burke's destroyers, and one by Austin's. Initial torpedo salvos from both sides failed to score. The American cruisers' radar-controlled gunfire converged on the nearest ship, light cruiser Sendai, at 2:50 a.m. November 2, and made 5 or more hits which jammed her rudder. At 3:01 a.m., Merrill led his cruisers on a colossal figure 8 to hold an advantageous range and spoil the enemy's aim. His cruisers dished out 6-inch gunfire as they zigzagged violently at 30 knots, but did little damage, and by 3:15 a.m. Omori's 8-inch fire began to improve, straddling repeatedly. Denver alone was hit, but only by duds. Japanese planes now approached Merrill's force and dropped both white and coloured flares. At that point in the battle, a cloud ceiling hung high over the cruisers, acting as a silver reflector to the flares and starshell. These brilliantly lighted up the 4 graceful vessels as their prows hissed through the black waters, in which their salvos were reflected as broken splashes of orange light. Geysers from the enemy's 8-inch misses rose deliberately from the sea like fountains in a princely garden. They flashed red, green, and gold as they reflected the flares and the cruiser's gunfire, poised immobile for a split second, then tumbled in a shower of phosphorescent spume. It was one of those rare moments of awful beauty sometimes vouchsafed to those who do business in great waters. Optimistic Omori, thinking that he had sunk 2 cruisers and completed a good night's work, ordered retirement at 3:37 a.m. The two destroyer divisions, although given the freedom of action that destroyer men craved, did not do well. They were like lusty children stumbling when just released from leading strings. Destroyer Division 45 became separated, and it took Burke a full hour to get his ships back in formation. By that time there was not much left for them to do except pump a couple of torpedoes into disabled Sendai. Destroyer Division 46 finished off destroyer Hatsukaze, which had been damaged in a collision with Omori's flagship. But Foote, on the other hand, took a torpedo intended for the cruisers and lost her fantail. Both division commanders wanted to chase the Japanese back to Rabaul, but Merrill, expecting an air attack from that hornet's nest at dawn, called all units to him and started to retire at 5 a.m. 3 hours later, his disposition was attacked by over 100 of the Japanese carrier planes now based at Rabaul. Merrill manoeuvred his ships so nimbly that they received only 2 hits, neither lethal. He thoroughly deserved victory over a force greatly his superior in torpedo power and gunfire. In a constantly changing tactical situation, he kept his poise and power of quick decision. His cruisers functioned as a well-drilled team. The Battle of Empress Augusta Bay is a refreshing contrast to earlier cruiser night actions. Admiral Halsey now seized the initiative by ordering carrier strikes on Rabaul to eliminate the great number of aircraft still based there, and to bomb 7 heavy cruisers which Koga had sent south from Truk, in the fatuous expectation of cleaning up on Merrill's remnants. Rear Admiral Frederick Sherman's task force, built around Saratoga and the new light carrier Princeton, so damaged these ships on 5 November that the Japanese never again committed heavy cruisers to those waters. This performance was more than bettered on 11 November by Rear Admiral Alfred E. Montgomery's task group, built around Essex, Bunker Hill and Independence, which here made their debut. The Japanese counterattacked with Rabaul-based planes, but lost heavily, and Koga withdrew his crippled ships and the few remaining carrier planes from Rabaul to Truk. He had expended another naval air group for nothing, and the Pacific Fleet had proved that carriers could profitably be pitted against a powerful land air base. In the meantime, fresh echelons were pouring into the Bougainville beachhead. By 14 November, 33,861 men and 23,137 tons of supplies had been landed at Empress Augusta Bay. But could the defensive perimeter set up around the beachhead be defended while the Seabees built airstrips and a full-fledged airdrome? The Marines were equal to it. A Japanese infantry regiment, first to press through the jungle and try Guadalcanal tactics on them, got the treatment on Thanksgiving Day. On that same day, the 25th, there was even greater cause for Thanksgiving, when Arleigh Burke's Destroyer Squadron 23, now reduced to 5 destroyers, 2 of them Count Austin's, intercepted a Japanese 5-destroyer team running reinforcements into Buka. Off Cape St. George, New Ireland, they clashed at 1:56 a.m. The surprised Japanese lost 2 new 2,000-ton destroyers from torpedo explosions, and a third by gunfire, without making a single hit. It was as good a clean-up as Moosbrugger's at Vella Gulf. The Allies were not long permitted to enjoy their Bougainville toehold in peace. General Hyakutake, the island commander, had some 40,000 soldiers and 20,000 sailors under him. All through January and February 1944, he was moving them along jungle trails and in barges that hid out by day and crawled along shore by night in the hope of rubbing out the Allied perimeter. General Griswold, to defend it, had about 27,000 combatant troops, the Bougainville Navy of small craft and PTs, commanded by the redoubtable Captain O.O. Kessing, and about 100 Airsols planes. Halsey sent him 6 destroyers for naval gunfire support, and these were credited with defeating one of several enemy attacks on what was intended to be the fatal day, 9 March 1944. 2 more attempts, both failures, were made by the Japanese within a week. Their losses were in the proportion of 20 to R1. During July and August 1943, while Halsey and Wilkinson slowly masticated the Central Solomons, MacArthur and Barbie had to be content with digesting their easily won gains in the Trobriand Islands and Nassau Bay. To that minor landing the Japanese reacted by setting up a barge line to carry troops from New Britain to the threatened New Guinea bases. General MacArthur wisely decided to take both places and Finschhafen too. His prerequisite for success was local air superiority. MacArthur, at 64, somewhat elderly for active duty, was air-minded as the youngest pilot in the Army Air Force or Forces. He had learned a great lesson of the air age, never needlessly to expose troops or ships to an enemy supreme in the air. A contingent of the Southwest Pacific Air Forces raided Eniwetok, the principal Japanese base in New Guinea, 17 to 18 August, and destroyed over 100 planes. General Kenny seized the Japanese airstrip at Nadzab on 5 September by a surprise paratroop drop of 1,700 men. Next day, Australian troops, lifted by Dan Barby's 7th Fib from Milne Bay, landed on beaches near Lae and seized that place on the 16th. Salamaua had already fallen to another group of Aussies. Finschhafen succumbed to a repeat performance by 2 October 1943. 7th Fleet was now in reasonably full control of Vitiaz Strait, but General MacArthur wanted Dampier Strait too, in order to dominate all passages between New Britain and New Guinea. That was his reason for landing the 1st Marine Division, Major General Rupertus, on Cape Gloucester. It was a big shore-to-shore operation, mounted in beaching craft by 7th Fib in Papua, and covered by a mixed United States Navy and Royal Australian Navy cruiser group, commanded by Admiral Crutchley. After passing a hot and stuffy Christmas at sea, the Marines were landed at Cape Gloucester on the 26th. They found that place to be even worse than Guadalcanal, because the rain never stopped. After suffering heavy losses, they secured a beachhead and a perimeter by 16 January 1944. Since Rabaul had always been the main objective of Operation Watchtower, it was a shock to General MacArthur when General Marshall on 21 July 1943 suggested that he leapfrog Rabaul instead of assaulting it. The combined chiefs of staff at their Quebec meeting in August directed Halsey and MacArthur to do just that, and as Rabaul's substitute occupy Cavien in New Ireland and Manus in the Admiralties. This major leap, coupled with a later decision to bypass Cavien as well, proved to be fortunate. Rabaul still had close to 100,000 defenders under a tough and resourceful general. Since it had been a stockpiling base for various invasions which never came off, the Japanese garrison had plenty of provisions, munitions, weapons and supplies. They kept busy, digging caves and concealed gun positions, and constructing fields of fire and booby traps that should have enabled them to repulse any amphibious operation that the Allies could have laid on. The last important leap that isolated Rabaul was made by MacArthur into the Admiralty Islands. This was not supposed to come off until 1 April 1944, but on the basis of a B-25 pilot's report that the islands were empty of Japanese, General MacArthur decided to pull off a reconnaissance in force and to accompany it himself. This kind of reconnaissance means that you send enough men to stay if the target is weakly defended, but not too many to make a brisk retreat if the enemy is there in strength. The 1st Cavalry Division United States Army supplied over 1,000 troopers, minus boots, saddles and sabres. Barby's 7th Fib lifted them as usual. The troopers were landed on Los Negros Island without opposition on 29 February. It turned out that the B-25 pilot was wrong. About 4,000 of the Japanese were present and started making trouble that very night. But MacArthur decided to let the troopers stay and to reinforce them quickly, because from his knowledge of Japanese ground tactics, he rightly predicted that the enemy would commit his army piecemeal, and that each small package could be defeated. With the aid of almost the entire 7th Fleet, abundant air power and sundry ground troops, the Americans moved from Los Negros into Manus, the biggest island of the group. By 3 April they were in control of the magnificent, deep, landlocked Sea Adler harbour, 15 miles long and 4 wide. Far better as a base than Rabaul, and nearer Japan, the Admiralties became one of the most important staging points in the last 15 months of the Pacific War. In the meantime, there had been big doings along the other road to Tokyo through the Central Pacific. In Allied circles, very little was known of enemy activities in the Gilbert Islands, which the Japanese Navy captured in September 1942, and even less of the Marshalls, for which Japan obtained the mandate after World War I. Photographic reconnaissance could not stretch up to the Marshalls, even from Funafuti, which the United States occupied on 2 October 1942. Submarines Pompano, Stingray and Plunger reconnoitred Rongerik, Bikini, Eniwetok and several minor atolls in February-March, but a fisheye view does not reveal what is going on ashore. Combined fleet might have rendezvoused in Kwajalein Lagoon, and half a dozen new airfields might have been constructed without the news reaching Pearl Harbor. Admiral King, always alert to seize opportunities on 9 February 1943, invited Admiral Nimitz's comment on an operation to secure the Gilbert Islands. Commander-in-Chief Pacific Fleet thought the suggestion premature. No ground troops were yet available, and no naval forces could be spared from the Central Solomons operation, coming up in June. Modern warfare has to be planned far ahead. Improvisation may lead to disaster. Why then did the Marshalls become a priority target in the Joint Chiefs' 20 May plan for the defeat of Japan? Their object was to attain positions in the Western Pacific from which Japan's unconditional surrender could be forced, possibly by air action alone, probably by invasion after repeated airstrikes on her industrial cities. The key target to this plan, short of Japan itself, was a base at or near Hong Kong, and although that key fell, owing to Japan's sealing off the entire coast of China, a good part of the plan endured. In brief, it amounted to this: parallel, simultaneous carrier and amphibious operations through Gilberts and Marshalls, the Bismarck Archipelago, and from the Indian Ocean into Burma. The first we are about to relate. Operation Watchtower, which, as we have already told, was concluded with the neutralization of Rabaul, Burma was postponed again and again. The basic idea was this: an offensive through Micronesia, Gilberts, Marshalls, Carolines, must be pushed at the same time as MacArthur's New Guinea, Mindanao approach to Japan. The one would support the other, and the fast carrier forces, now being augmented by the Essex class, could freewheel between the two. It was a very bold plan. Nothing in past warfare told how amphibious forces could advance in great leaps across an ocean where the enemy had dozens of island bases. The series of operations we are about to relate were one of the finest achievements in World War II. Commander-in-Chief Pacific Fleet, after a good photo reconnaissance of the Gilberts, convinced the Joint Chiefs of Staff that we had better take Tarawa and Makin for air bases before trying the Marshalls, and the Joint Chiefs of Staff issued the directive on 20 July 1943. Operation Galvanic was now definitely on the timetable for November. 5th Fleet, organised 15 March 1943, from what had been the Central Pacific component of the Pacific Fleet, was at last formidable. It had the new Lexington, the new Yorktown, 3 light carriers, 20 new 2,100-ton destroyers, and the new fast battleship Alabama. The Joint Chiefs of Staff informed Admiral Nimitz that by October he might count on double or triple these numbers, besides 27 transport types and a flock of new Kaiser-built escort carriers. Yamamoto was right. The Pacific Fleet had to be annihilated in 1942, or not at all. Vice Admiral Raymond A. Spruance left Nimitz's staff to become Commander 5th Fleet, and Rear Admiral R. Kelly Turner commanded the 5th Amphibious Force set up in August, leaving Rear Admiral Wilkinson to carry on, as we have seen, in the Solomons. The ground troops, the 5th Amphibious Corps, although not all Marines, were commanded by Major General Holland M. Smith. Planning and training for a big amphibious operation is probably the most difficult branch of military preparation. It never even approaches perfection because the units employed cannot be trained as a team. No one base is big enough to hold them all. In an operation requiring the most detailed planning and the nicest timing, Admiral Turner commanded men of the Army, Navy and Marine Corps attached to ships, planes and ground forces, in points as far apart as New Zealand, Hawaii, San Diego and Alaska, organised in units very few of which he could even see before D-Day. There were preliminary carrier plane strikes on Tarawa and Makin, submarine and photographic reconnaissance, and diversionary strikes on other islands such as Wake and Marcus, to confuse the Japanese. Every day for the week 13 to 20 November, Army and Navy liberators bombed Tarawa and Makin. The sortie of surface forces from Pearl Harbor began as early as 21 October. Never before had there been such intensive activity in Pearl Harbor, in the Fijis and in the New Hebrides, as during the last days of October and the 1st of November 1943. Then, suddenly, every harbour and roadstead was deserted. Over 200 sail, the Fifth Fleet carrying 108,000 American soldiers, sailors, marines and aviators, under the command of taut Raymond Spruance, gallant Harry Hill and bristling Kelly Turner, were on the high seas. By various and devious routes, they converged on two coral atolls, whose names will be remembered as long as men prize valour, Makin and Tarawa. We may dispose of the easier task first. This was Butaritari Island, Makin Atoll, defended by only 300 Japanese combat troops, with no higher officer than a lieutenant, and 500 labour troops. The landing was easy, but the ground troops made infuriatingly slow progress, as General Howling Mad Smith put it, despite a 23-1 superiority. These were two regiments from the 27th Infantry Division, a New York National Guard outfit that had gone stale from too long training. Thus, it was not until the fourth day of the assault, 24 November, that their commander could signal Makin taken. The taking cost the Army 64 killed and 150 wounded. It was the Navy that paid dear. Admiral Koga, Commander-in-Chief Combined Fleet, committed 9 submarines to break up the massive forces supporting the Gilbert Islands landings, and owing to the slow work of our ground troops, which required naval forces to stay near the island, Submarine 175 scored heavily. She torpedoed and sank escort carrier Liscombe Bay on 24 November, taking the lives of Captain I.D. Wiltsey, Rear Admiral Henry M. Mullinix, and 642 others. All Japanese air counterattacks were thwarted by planes from aircraft carriers that Admiral Spruance brought up for that very purpose. Their presence was a major factor in persuading Admiral Koga to keep Combined Fleet snug in Truk. But he fleeted up a few dozen land-based planes from Truk to Kwajalein, and these, after sunset Thanksgiving Day, 25 November, put on a beautiful show, a night attack on Admiral Turner's force of battleships, cruisers and escort carriers, operating about 60 miles east of Makin. The technique of Japanese night air attacks at this period of the war was spectacular. First, snoopers dropped strings of coloured floatlights to guide bombers to the enemy ships. When the bombers approached, the snoopers flew high over the ships and dropped parachute flares, of a brilliance that none of our pyrotechnicians could match. Then the dive and torpedo bombers bore in. Turner, an old hand at evading air attack, won this contest of wits. His ships had been intensively drilled in radical simultaneous turns on the voyage from Pearl Harbor, and they performed so many that night as to afford the enemy no opportunity to score. On the same Thanksgiving Day night, when Arleigh Burke was sinking Japanese destroyers off Cape St. George, a group of Japanese planes attacked Rear Admiral Radford's Northern Carrier Group, Enterprise, Belleau Wood, Monterey, which had been furnishing air support for the Gilbert Islands operation. Raddy had trained a radar-equipped night combat air patrol and a group of night fighters as well. They saw to it that not one hit was made on the carriers. But Commander E. H. O'Hare, one of the best pilots in the Navy, was shot down. Thus, Makin was taken at slight cost by the Army, but at considerable cost to the Navy. It provided vivid proof of the necessity of speed in conquering an island, so as to release the covering naval forces promptly. But in marked contrast to Guadalcanal, the main Japanese fleet was never committed, because it had been temporarily paralysed by the air attacks on Rabaul. Betio Island, at the southwest corner of Tarawa Atoll, in shape resembles an old-fashioned muzzle-loading musket, complete with stock, lock and barrel, pointing a little south of east. The total length is only 3,800 yards. The width, 500 yards at the stock, 600 at the lock, tapering off to a point on the barrel. The area is less than 300 acres. An airfield occupied the wide centre part, and the rest of the island was covered with a stand of coconut palms, under which a complete defensive system had been installed. The atoll commander, Rear Admiral Shibasaki, had 4,500 picked troops under him, tough as mountain goats, and indoctrinated to fight to the last man. As they did, only 17 were taken prisoner. These troops had been there over a year with nothing to do but pepper the island with strongpoints. They had plenty of weapons, even 8-inch British naval guns captured at Singapore, and enough bomb-proof shelters to hold the entire garrison. No small island was ever so well protected or stubbornly defended as Betio. Rear Admiral Hill commanded the southern attack force that took Tarawa. In contrast to the dour and saturnine Turner, Harry Hill was a sanguine, genial officer who thought and talked like a young man and preferred to lead rather than drive. The landing force, the 2nd Marine Division, reinforced to about 18,600 men, was commanded by Major General Julian C. Smith, a student of the art of war and of human nature, who had the complete confidence of his officers and men. Admiral Hill and General Smith came up in Battleship Maryland, a rehabilitated victim of Pearl Harbor. Pacific Fleet as yet had no specially equipped amphibious command ship, such as Hewitt enjoyed in Sicily, and Maryland's communications system, inadequate at best, had an annoying habit of conking out with each main battery salvo. Beaches on the lagoon side of Betio were chosen as the least difficult of 3 tough places. The planners hoped that by landing on a 3-battalion front, the Marines could sweep across the island and capture the airfield in short order. The trouble with this lagoon-side landing was that transports had to unload outside, so that a 10-mile trip with a turn was required for landing craft. And, if the boats could not float over a wide shelving coral reef, the troops would have to wade. Tarawa tides at this season were unpredictable, and we drew the worst. The Navy badly miscalculated the amount of softening up that could be done in 2.5 daylight hours bombardment on the morning of D-Day 20 November, preceded and followed by air bombing from the attendant carriers. All coast defence guns were silenced, and some destruction was done, but not nearly enough. Nobody yet realised how much punishment the Japanese could take when protected by heavy concrete or several layers of coconut logs and coral sand. This was the first operation to use a large number of amphitracks, landing vehicles tracked. These, developed from alligators used in the Florida Everglades before the war, were 25-foot amphibious tractors that could carry 25 men and 2 machine guns, make 4 knots in the water, climb over coral reefs if necessary, and operate as tanks on land. 93 landing vehicles tracked, of which 90 were expended, made up the first 3 assault waves commanded by Colonel David M. Shoup. Delayed by a heavy chop and westerly set of current, they began hitting the beach at 9:13 a.m. That was already 28 minutes after an already once-postponed H-hour. This delay wrecked the landing timetable, to which an amphibious operation has to stick rigidly for success. Admiral Hill did not dare deliver gunfire support after 8:55 a.m. because both island and lagoon were under a pall of smoke, and he feared hitting the landing craft. The ceasefire afforded the Japanese 20 minutes grace, which they employed to transfer troops from the south shore to rifle pits and machine gun nests on the lagoon side. Many Japanese guns had the landing vehicles tracked under crossfire before landing. After the amphitracks came a wave of tank-loaded landing craft, mechanized from landing ship Doc Ashland. These, stranded on the coral apron by an unexpectedly low tide, had to discharge Sherman tanks in 3 to 4 feet of water, which drowned out some of the engines. And as no landing craft could float over the reef, troops had to wade for 400 to 500 yards under heavy fire, in water waist-deep, which meant death by drowning for a wound or a stumble. Between noon and 2 p.m., the situation ashore was very critical. Some 1,500 Marines were pinned down on a narrow beach under a wall of coconut logs and coral blocks, behind which the enemy was shooting everything he had at men wading ashore. General Julian Smith at 1:30 p.m. radioed General H.M. Smith, who was in Battleship Pennsylvania off Makin, requesting release of the reserve and ending with the ominous words, "Issue in doubt." By the end of D-Day, about 5,000 Marines had landed, but at least 1,500 had been killed or wounded. Intrepid officers led small squads inland, rooting out defenders as they advanced, and established a 300-yard-wide beachhead by evening. Next day, 21 November, Major L.C. Hayes's battalion of the Divisional Reserve fought its way ashore, losing 13 officers and 331 men in so doing. Around noon that day, when the laggard tide finally rose and landing craft could steam right up to the beach, the tide of battle turned. Next day, the Japanese were thrust into 2 or 3 pockets, and by the end of the 23rd these had been eliminated. The first American plane landed on the airstrip at noon. It only remained to send a squad of Marines up the atoll to rescue the Catholic mission station in the northern part and to exterminate the last of the Japanese garrison. Tarawa was ours at heavy cost, the lives of over 1,000 Marines and sailors, with more than double that number of wounded. They were not wasted. As a result of intensive study of reports by everyone, from admirals and generals down to boatwave ensigns, many valuable lessons were learned, and these rendered most later amphibious operations in the Pacific, in comparison, pushovers. The relatively easy conquest of Kwajalein in January 1944 is owed to lessons learned at Tarawa. To a perfect take-off position, the triangle Tarawa, Makin, Abemama, captured in November, and to using this position, as well as carrier planes, for photographic reconnaissance and for neutralizing enemy air power in the Marshalls before D-Day. All honor, then, to the fighting heart of the United States Marine. Let the battle for that small stretch of coral sand called Betio of Tarawa be remembered as terrible indeed, but glorious, and the seedbed for victory in 1945. Although it had long since been decided that the Marshalls would come next after the Gilberts, it was not determined until December what would happen after that. Should the now vastly stronger Pacific Fleet combine with Kinkaid's 7th Fleet to help General MacArthur roll up the back of the New Guinea bird into the Celebes Sea and on to Mindanao? Or should the General be left to do that with his own navy, and Admiral Nimitz continue to hew out a second road to Tokyo across the Central Pacific? Admiral King won the approval of the Combined Chiefs of Staff in its Sextant Conference at Cairo on 3 December 1943 for the Nimitz plan of dual approach. Their principal directive was as follows: the advance along the New Guinea, Netherlands, East Indies. Philippine Axis will proceed concurrently with operations for the capture of the mandated islands. A strategic bombing force will be established in Guam, Tinian and Saipan for strategic bombing of Japan proper. This bombing force meant the superfortresses, the B-29s. The need of a base for them in the Marianas was a principal reason why the King-Nimitz idea prevailed over the all-under-MacArthur plan. Other reasons were, first, the planned all-British amphibious operation to retake Burma as a second front against Japan had been scrapped. Second, fast carrier forces of the Pacific Fleet were not suitable for employment in the narrow seas south of the Philippines, with Japanese air bases on all sides. Third, Saipan would make an ideal advanced base for United States submarines, which with new and more effective torpedoes had finally got into their stride and were rapidly reducing Japanese merchant tonnage. Momentum, a word that continually recurs in strategic discussions, was a great consideration, for the closer that one offensive steps on the heels of the other, the greater will be one's gain and the enemy's loss and confusion. Japan had proved that in early 1942. We now intended to turn the same principle against her. Momentum settled the question of which Marshall atolls should be taken and which leapfrogged. Nimitz's bold plan provided that undefended Majuro be taken first, for the sake of its anchorage. That both ends of Kwajalein, the hub of the enemy's defence system, be assaulted simultaneously the second day, and that Eniwetok be taken as soon as possible thereafter. All the rest of the atolls, even those with airfields, would be skipped. Admirals Spruance and Turner and General H.M. Smith argued against the plan as too bold. But Nimitz correctly estimated that his fast carrier forces, together with aircraft based on the Makin-Tarawa-Abemama triangle, could neutralize Japanese air power in the Marshalls before operation began, and he now had enough battleships and heavy cruisers to take on the combined fleet in case it sortied from Truk. Fast Carrier Force Pacific Fleet had become really formidable by the first of the new year. Besides Old Big E and Sarah, Rear Admiral Mitcher had Essex and 3 more of her class, 6 light carriers of the Independence class, with new Iowa-class battleships and plenty of cruisers and destroyers to screen them. Divided into 4 task groups, they raided 1 or more atolls in the Marshalls every day from 29 January to 6 February, virtually destroying enemy air and sea power in the archipelago before the amphibious operation began. And they covered it thereafter. Escort carriers were also present to furnish close air support. Rear Admiral Turner, at last in an amphibious command ship, Rocky Mount, commanded the entire expeditionary force. Rear Admiral Connolly, fresh from participation in the Salerno operation, took charge of the northern half, lifting the new 4th Marine Division to occupy Roy and Namur Islands on Kwajalein Atoll. Turner himself commanded the southern half, lifting the 7th Infantry Division to take Kwajalein Island. Japan made almost no attempt to counter this massive onslaught. The Halsey-MacArthur campaign against the Bismarck's barrier had thrown her forces off balance. Admiral Koga dared not commit combined fleet, because his carrier air groups had been expended to defend Rabaul. The Marshals were only a holding front for the Japanese. Imperial headquarters decided to expend the garrisons and strengthen the next defensive perimeter: Timor, Western New Guinea, Truk, Marianas. A force of submarines was sent up from Truk to do what it could, but not one got a lethal hit, and 4, including I-175, which had torpedoed Liscombe Bay off Makin, were sunk by our destroyers or destroyer escorts. Majuro, the undefended atoll, was occupied 31 January 1944 by the attack group under Rear Admiral Hill, which later went on to take Eniwetok. Compared with other atolls where the garrison had to camp among the debris of battle, Majuro proved a paradise for American soldiers and sailors. Its spacious lagoon well served the new mobile supply force of auxiliaries under Captain Worrell R. Carter, who became senior officer present afloat Majuro. Kwajalein is the world's largest coral atoll, composed of a string of 100 islands and islets, enclosing an irregularly shaped lagoon 66 miles long and at places 20 miles wide. At the southeast corner is Kwajalein Island, where the Japanese were constructing a bomber strip. At the northern tip were 2 small connected islands, Roy and Namur, within whose small area, 1.25 miles long and 3/4 wide, the Japanese had 3,500 troops and an airfield. This pair was the objective of Admiral Connolly's northern force. Since it was impractical to make a surf landing on the outer coast, it was necessary to boat the assault troops outside, where the atoll made some sort of lee, and bring them into the lagoon through narrow passes which fortunately the enemy had neglected to fortify. But the landing plan had to be so fussy and complicated that plenty of things went wrong. Every foul-up was finally straightened out, and every D-Day, 31 January, objective attained shortly before nightfall. Casualties amounted to 24 dead and missing and 40 wounded. Then the real agony began. 3 days preliminary air bombing and naval bombardment, this at such close range that the Admiral got the nickname Close-In Connolly, were not enough to pulverize the Roy Namur rectangle, although a vast amount of damage was done, and possibly half the Japanese defenders killed. The rest had to be rooted out, man by man. Roy was secured by the evening of 1 February, Namur next day. It was a stinking mess of debris and dead Japanese. Hardly a tree was left alive in what had been a pretty wooded island, and of the 100 or more buildings not one was usable. A dismal prospect met the garrison group when it steamed into the lagoon a few days later to relieve the 4th Division. All air protection was removed when the carriers retired, and the particular Seabee outfit sent in with the garrison was so lazy and inefficient that by 12 February the runways were not yet ready to receive planes. That day these islands received a stinging backlash from the Japanese. A flight of several 4-engine bombers from Saipan, staged through Ponape, hit Roy Namur, and with its bombs touched off an ammunition dump whose explosion killed many Marines and destroyed immense quantities of food and equipment. The southern attack on boomerang-shaped Kwajalein Island was characterized by a large contingent of landing vehicles, tracked and DQWs, and by perfect cooperation between Army and Navy. Here, too, D-Day, 31 January, was devoted to securing islets adjacent to the objective and basing artillery thereon for the main assault. Admiral Turner, first to admit that Tarawa had not been bombarded long enough or well enough, was determined that this island should be properly pulverized. To execute this worthy object, he started it with 4 battleships, 3 heavy cruisers, 11 destroyers, and 3 escort carriers on 30 January. He continued it all next day, and on D-Day, 1 February, from 6:18 a.m. to 8:40 a.m. and from 9:30 a.m. to H-hour 9:30 a.m. and a drop of 2,000-pound bombs flown up from Tarawa was thrown in. A well-executed amphibious assault is as beautiful a military spectacle as one can find in warfare, and this one was superbly done in a setting of deep blue, white-capped sea, fluffy trade wind clouds, flashing gunfire and billowing smoke over the target, gaily coloured flag hoists at the yard arms of the ships and on the signal halyards of the control craft. At 9:28 a.m., all 4 landing vehicle-tracked waves were approaching the beach in line, not one of the 84 amph tracks falling behind more than a couple of lengths, their cupped tracks churning the blue water into curling sheepskins of white foam, and their square bows throwing spray until everyone on board was drenched, but nobody cared. This was what the 7th Division had come for, to kill more of those you-know-what who had cost them so many buddies on Attu. Landing craft infantry gunboats were flashing and crackling. Battleships offshore were booming and belching huge gobs of orange-tinted smoke, and on the island palm trees and parts of buildings were rising in the air. First wave hit the beaches right at H-hour 9:30 a.m. Within 12 minutes, 1,200 officers and men had landed without a single casualty. But the Japanese were not wiped out. Rear Admiral Akiyama, the island commander, had prepared his defences well, and at least half of his more than 5,000 troops were still alive. In the centre was a complex of trenches, anti-tank traps, pillboxes, blockhouses and air raid shelters, and here the invading infantrymen ran into trouble. The island had to be taken inch by inch and was not secured until the morning of 5 February. Except for about 35 men who surrendered, the garrison was annihilated. It only remained in this southern sector of the Bit Atoll to take Ebai, where there was a garrison of 400 and a few lesser islets. By 7 February, Kwajalein Atoll was entirely American. One of the most complicated amphibious campaigns in history, involving landings on 30 different islets, fights on at least 10, and bloody battles on 3, had come to a successful conclusion within a week. The price was far less than had been paid for the Gilberts. The Navy suffered negligible casualties. Out of 41,000 troops committed, 372 soldiers and marines died on this atoll. On the Japanese side, 7,870 men out of 8,675 were wiped out. With Kwajalein in the bag, flag officers and generals turned their attention to Eniwetok Atoll. Admiral Spruance asked Nimitz to let him push right on to this western outpost to the Marshalls, 326 miles west-northwest of Roy, and only 1,000 miles from the Marianas. The very name Eniwetok, meaning land between west and east, suggests strategic importance. For the primitive Micronesians, it had been a place of call and refreshment in their long canoe voyages from west to east. Now it would become an important staging point for the United States Army, Navy and Marine Corps in their spectacular progress from east to west. Spruance had his wish, and detailed planning began on board Turner's command ship Rocky Mount on 14 February. Captain D.W. Loomis's reserve force, waiting at Majuro Lagoon, was already tagged for catchpole, code name for the Eniwetok operation, and Admiral Hill eagerly assumed the top command. But the destructive attack of 12 February on Roy Namur by Japanese long-range bombers from Saipan, staged through Ponape, proved that this island and Truk needed attention before Eniwetok could be captured. Liberators of General Willis Hale's 7th Army Air Force, based at Tarawa, pounded Ponape between 15 and 26 February, to such good purpose that there could be no interference thence. And on Eniwetok D-Day, 17 February, the fast carrier forces began a 2-day visit to Truk, which rendered this Gibraltar of the Pacific little more used to Japan, and unnecessary for us to capture. An Air Sols reconnaissance plane on 4 February found a good part of combined fleet in Truk Lagoon, but Admiral Koga got most of his ships out in time. Light cruiser Agano, however, was sunk by United States submarine skate, Lieutenant Commander W.F. Gruner, as she sorted. Mitcher's flyers found some 50 merchant ships in the lagoon and 365 aircraft on the airfields when they jumped the atoll at dawn 17 February. Their first strike of 72 fighters, followed by 18 Avengers dropping incendiaries, left fewer than 100 Japanese planes operational. In the meantime, Mitcher's dive bombers were merrily knocking off ships in the lagoon. That evening, the enemy got off his one and only counterattack and managed to make a hit on carrier Intrepid, whose propensity to collect Japanese bombs and torpedoes earned her a nickname, the Evil Ung. In the meantime, Admiral Spruance in battleship New Jersey was conducting a round-the-atoll cruise with Iowa, 2 heavy cruisers and 4 destroyers, to catch escaping ships. They sank light cruiser Katori and destroyer Maikaze, but destroyer Nowaki, straddled by the battle wagon's 16-inch salvos at ranges between 17 and 20 miles, managed to escape unhurt and even launched a spread of torpedoes. That night, Mitcher started bombing with specially equipped Avengers. Flight operations were resumed by Enterprise, Yorktown, Essex and Bunker Hill at dawn 18 February. And by noon, when Mitcher decided to pick up and retire, his aviators had destroyed 200,000 tons of merchant shipping, 2 destroyers and some 275 planes. This 2 days and 1 night raid on Truk was one of the most successful of the war. For the first time, a major enemy base was beaten down without the aid of land-based air power or an amphibious invasion. Truk was still usable for planes, and the buildings were not too badly damaged, but it had become as vulnerable to the Japanese as Pearl Harbor had been to the Pacific Fleet on 7 December 1941. Never again would the 8-rayed flag of Commander-in-Chief Combined Fleet meet the rising sun in Truk Lagoon. The capture of Eniwetok could now proceed without interference from a single enemy plane. The landings at Engebe Island in the north on 17 February by the 22nd Marine Regiment, Brigadier General T.E. Watson, were similar in character to those at Roynamur, and even more complicated. The 1,000 or more Japanese defenders were rendered punch-drunk by the preliminary bombardment and offered comparatively light resistance. Engebe was ours by 4:40 p.m., February 18, at the cost of 85 Marines killed. But the southern operations against Parry and Eniwetok Islands turned up a number of surprises. The Japanese neatly fooled the invaders into believing that these islands were unoccupied. They had concealed themselves and their weapons from photo-interpreters of the Pacific Fleet and from the eyes of Admiral Hill's lookouts when his ships passed only a biscuit toss from Parry to enter the lagoon. An intelligence team, combing through the debris on Engebe, found papers indicating that Eniwetok and Parry Islands were actually defended by 9:55 p.m. men of Major General Nishida's 1st Amphibious Brigade, a veteran unit of the toughest fighters bred in Japan. Faced with this situation, General Watson brought all possible strength to bear upon each island in succession. He decided to throw both battalions of the 106th Infantry Regiment into Eniwetok Island, southernmost of the atoll, together with a Marine Reserve battalion brought down from Engebe. Eniwetok Island was not secured until 4:30 p.m., February 21. It cost only 37 American lives and 94 wounded. The Japanese garrison of about 800 men, except for 23 taken prisoner, was annihilated. Gunfire support ships had plenty of time to pound Parry Island north of Eniwetok, fortunately, since 1:50 p.m. hidey-hole Japanese were there. When the Marine Corps landings began at 9 a.m. February 22, the enemy was still full of fight, and his emplacements were so well concealed as to be difficult to spot even a few feet away. Assault troops pushed rapidly forward behind tanks, with demolition and flamethrower parties directly behind to burn out each enemy nest. But the terrain was studded with mines which detonated on 35 pounds pressure and tore men apart horribly, blowing their bodies to bits. In the afternoon, in skirmish line, the Marines pushed on to their final goal, the southern end where the enemy was in the open. "Finally, we killed them all," wrote Lieutenant Cord Meyer. There was not much jubilation. We just sat and stared at the sand, and most of us thought of those who were gone, those whom I shall remember as always young, smiling and graceful, and I shall try to forget how they looked at the end, beyond all recognition. It was one of those many, many times in the war when you had time to stop and think about it, and wonder why mankind is not wise enough to end this senseless suffering and slaughter. Eniwetok Atoll was secured, at a cost of 339 Americans killed and missing, and 2,677 Japanese. 4 atolls of the Marshalls Group where the enemy had air bases, Jaluit, Mili, Malolap, Voce and Nauru too, had been bypassed, but it was easy to keep them isolated until the war's end. In addition, there were some 50 atolls where only a handful of Japanese, or none, were living. The now famous Bikini, for instance, was occupied by a detachment of Marines in one landing craft after the garrison of 5 Japanese had committed suicide. Looking back, Admiral Dick Connolly said, "The Marshalls really cracked the Japanese shell. It broke the crust of their defences on a scale that could be exploited at once. It gave them no time adequately to fortify their inner defence line that ran through the Marianas. Operations Catchpole and Flintlock and the strikes on Truk enhanced the reputation of the United States Navy, courage and determination it had shown from the first. But in the Marshalls it demonstrated mastery of the art of amphibious warfare, of combining air, surface, submarine and ground forces to project fighting power irresistibly across the ocean. While Spruance's 5th Fleet and Turner's 5th Fib Force were crashing through the Central Pacific to Eniwetok, Kincaid's 7th Fleet and Barbie's 7th Fib were making equally spectacular leaps along New Guinea. These were shore-to-shore operations, performed largely in the 3 leading types of beaching craft, landing ship tank, landing craft tank, and landing craft, infantry, of which MacArthur never had enough. The last 2 types, the 114-foot landing craft tank and the 173-foot landing craft infantry, had to perform long hauls and house crews for months on end in compartments designed for a night run across the English Channel. Fast converted destroyer transports were also used. The covering forces were meagre compared with the array of powerful gunfire ships disposed of by Spruance. Rear Admiral Crutchley had 2 heavy cruisers, His Majesty's Australian ship Australia, Flag and a few destroyers. Rear Admiral Berkey had 3 light cruisers Phoenix, Flag and a few more destroyers. 7th Fleet had 4 squadrons of amphibious Catalinas, each with its tender. But for air support it depended mainly on General Kenny's Southwest Pacific Air Force, with its many bases and ample strength on New Guinea. Under MacArthur, Generals Fischelberger and Kruger were in command of the ground operations. We left the Southwest Pacific Forces at Manus in the Admiralties in March 1944, after finally breaching the Bismarck Barrier and sealing off Rabaul. General MacArthur's next plan was to leapfrog the strong Japanese garrison at Wewak into Hollandia and set up new advance headquarters there. Some 215 vessels, mostly beaching craft, were divided into 3 attack groups, commanded by Rear Admiral Barbie, Rear Admiral Fechteler and Captain A.G. Noble, each in a destroyer, no luxurious amphibious command ships here. But each attack group had a landing ship dock to bring pre-boated tanks to the targets. By this time, it had become clear that the success of an amphibious operation depended in great measure on preliminary pounding of enemy air power at the target. By the end of March, the Japanese had assembled 351 aircraft on the airfields about Hollandia. On the 30th and on 3, 5 and 12 April, General Kenny made massive air attacks, which almost completely knocked out Hollandia as an enemy airbase. Carrier aircraft added frosting to the cake on 21 April, for General MacArthur had obtained an order that Mitch's flat tops must support him at Hollandia. It turned out the help was not needed. Not one enemy plane rose from the 5 target fields to intercept the carrier-borne bombers. The Hollandia operation was perfectly planned and smoothly executed. D-Day was 22 April, and by 3 May the Japanese airfields at Lake Sentani in the hills above the town were in our possession. Supreme Allied Commander Southwest Pacific needed no urging to push his westward advance rapidly along the New Guinea coast. General MacArthur had already outlined to his planning staff a series of assaults, all pointing toward Mindanao. Target date 15 November. 4 operations, Wakta, Biak, Noemfor and Sansapor, carried him and his forces to the northwest point of New Guinea's Vogal Cop, 550 miles west of Hollandia, in a little more than 3 months. 7th Fleet handled the highly important seaborne aspects of this advance, since the ocean was the only possible road. Motor torpedo boat squadrons, as eager as the Army Air Force to secure forward bases, also took part in this breathless race. Before the next operation came off, an invasion of the Waktasami area on 17 May, the disquieting discovery had been made that heavy bombers could not use the Lake Sentani airfields, and that no site suitable for them existed in Dutch New Guinea, short of Biak Island. Hence, until Biak could be taken, the heavies would have to continue operating from Nadzab, 440 miles east of Hollandia, or from the Admiralties. The need for full speed ahead being evident, General MacArthur decided to simplify the Waktasami operation and move on into Biak as soon as possible. Rear Admiral Fechterle, who commanded 7th Fib in Admiral Barby's absence, promised to assault Biak 10 days after Wakta, which was taken by Captain Noble's group of 7th Fib and the 163 Regimental Combat Team, Brigadier General Jens Doe, after 2 days fighting, on 19 May. Army engineers had made the airstrip operational even for liberators. But it was a long, tough job for the army to capture the adjacent mainland. Biak is one of the Schouten Islands that close in Guilvinck Bay, at the neck of the New Guinea bird. The occupation of this big, reef-fringed island started on 27 May. The landing force under Major General Horace F. Fuller and 7th Fib under Admiral Fechterle were fortunate to get away with it, since the 10,000 Japanese defenders were almost as numerous as the attacking force, and were not surprised. Colonel Kuzume, their commander, denied to us for a month the 2 Biak airfields within 10 miles of the landing beaches by a skillful defence in depth, tactics later developed at Peleliu and Iwo Jima. The Japanese Navy here tried to interfere with an amphibious operation for the first time since Bougainville. Admiral Toyoda realised that heavy bombers based at Biak would be a handicap to his plan for a big naval battle in mid-1944, a plan of which we shall hear more shortly. He therefore decided to transport 2,500 amphibious troops from Mindanao to Biak. 3 attempts were made by a reinforcement echelon of destroyers under Rear Admiral Sakonju, who was no Tanaka. Once he was turned back by a false report of an aircraft carrier, and on 8 June he was chased off by Crutchley's cruiser-destroyer force. Toyoda now assembled a really powerful striking force, built around super battleships Yamato and Musashi, which should have been able to sink anything in 7th Fleet. 3 days before it was to head for Biak, Commander-in-Chief Combined Fleet decided, correctly, that Spruance's 5th Fleet was about to land in the Marianas, and pulled all naval forces north into the Philippine Sea. Colonel Kuzume's stubborn but hopeless defence of Biak continued until 22 June. The capture of this island cost Allied ground forces 438 killed, 2,300 battle-wounded, and 3,500 cases of typhus. It became an important airbase in subsequent operations for the liberation of the Philippines. When Biak was proving difficult, General MacArthur's planners began looking for airfield sites on the Vogal Cop, the head of the New Guinea bird. They first pitched upon the almost circular island of Noemfoor, about 11 miles in diameter, midway between Biak and Manokwari. A task force was hurriedly assembled, a naval bombardment delivered on the morning of 2 July, and the landing made that afternoon. An important component of the assault force was boated-in landing craft mechanized, the 50-foot open landing craft mechanized, manned by amphibious army engineers. It took them 12 days to make the 700-mile passage from Finschhafen. To complete his control of New Guinea and prepare for the invasion of Mindanao, MacArthur wanted one more air base on the Vogal Cop. This was obtained at Sansapor on 30 July by Admiral Fechterle, commanding 16 destroyer types and numerous beaching craft mounted at Wakta. There was no opposition. Sansapor was MacArthur's last stop in New Guinea on his long return journey to the Philippines. This advance of 550 miles from Hollandia to Cape Sansapor required little more than 3 months, with 3 big Japanese air bases, Hollandia, Wakta, Biak, picked up en route, and a 4th, Wewak, leapfrogged. Expert planning and a high order of teamwork between Army, Navy and Air Forces of the United States and Australia produced these results, but it is questionable whether they could have been attained under any other commander but Douglas MacArthur. Everyone who served under him, in whatever arm of the service or from whatever country, acquired a great respect for his military judgment and leadership. We have seen how smartly his operations were executed, on or very close to the target dates set, with few of the snarls usual in military affairs. We shall now leave him consolidating his positions and preparing for his heart's desire, his return to the Philippines, while we shift our attention to great doings around the Marianas and in the broad reaches of the Philippine Sea. The 15 Mariana or Ladrone Islands stretch for some 425 miles in an arc, of which the 145th meridian east longitude is the chord. Starting with Farallon de Pajaros, 335 miles southeast of Iwo Jima, and ending with Guam, 250 miles north of the Carolines, this chain forms with the Bonins, the upright bar of the big Micronesian L, the foot of which is the Carolines and Marshalls. The four biggest Marianas, Saipan, Tinian, Rota and Guam, all at the southernmost end, are those with which we are concerned, only they had any military or economic value. On 23 February 1944, 5 days after the big strike on Truk, planes from Admiral Mitch's carriers dropped the first American bombs on the Marianas. Commander-in-Chief Pacific Fleet ordered this raid mainly to obtain photographic intelligence, no Allied plane having flown over these islands since the fall of Guam in December 1941. Pacific Fleet submarines were stationed around them to shoot surface game flushed by aircraft. Several ships sailed right into the periscope sights of Sunfish, Lieutenant Commander E. Shelby, which sank 2 Maris before and after daybreak on the 23rd. Tang, Lieutenant Commander R. H. O'Kane, sank 4 in as many days, and the total bag of shipping, including those sunk by carrier planes, came to about 45,000 tons. The decision to place Saipan, Tinian and Guam next on the program of conquest after the Marshalls, with target date 15 June, was not made by the Joint Chiefs of Staff until 12 March 1944. It was high time for a decision. The Pacific Fleet had become immensely powerful in every type of combatant ship and auxiliary, and was ready to deal another hard blow to the Japanese Empire. Most American ground forces had been allotted to the Great Invasion of Europe, but 3 Marine and 2 Army divisions in the Pacific were ready to take part in a major amphibious operation that summer. This was to be Vice Admiral R. Kelly Turner's 5th major amphibious operation. Schooled by adversity at Guadalcanal and Tarawa, he was not spoiled by success in the Marshalls. He had learned more about this specialized branch of warfare than anyone else ever had, or probably ever would. He supervised every detail himself, and there were plenty, because in an amphibious operation nothing can be left to chance, and perfect timing is the essence of success. Energetic, quick and nervous, Turner was apt to be abrupt to junior officers who came to him with new suggestions, then to think them over carefully and incorporate them in his next draft plan. For all his rugged personality and rough tongue, Kelly had a keen intellect and complete intellectual honesty. He drafted the concept, dated 4 April, on which Operation Forager was based. The objective is the capture of Saipan, Tinian and Guam, in order to secure control of sea communications through the Central Pacific for the support of further attacks on the Japanese. No amphibious operation on so vast a scale, with a final 1,000-mile hop, had before been planned, although Operation Torch was a close approximation. Inherent difficulties peculiar to amphibious warfare were enhanced by the distance of the Marianas from any Allied continental base, and by the operation's size. Some 535 combatant ships and auxiliaries carried 127,571 troops, of which over 2/3 were Marines. The destination lay 1,000 miles steaming from Eniwetok, the nearest advanced base, which was little more than an anchorage, and 3,500 miles from Pearl Harbor. Logistics problems alone would have condemned this operation as impossible in 1941, for the distance meant that the entire expeditionary force had to be afloat at the same time, and that the ships allotted could do nothing else for at least 3 months. It is difficult to change logistic plans for a series of naval offensives after the procession of shipborne supplies has started. The flow may be slowed down or diverted to alternate harbours and warehouses if available, but it cannot be reversed without immense confusion and waste. Operations of the magnitude and complexity of Forager and its successors were so new to American, or to any, logistics planners that few were capable of planning beyond the assault phase. Fortunately, Admiral Spruance, Commander 5th Fleet, was one of these few. He understood that Forager was but a means to a further end, and he saw to it that his and Turner's plans for the assault were coordinated with those for base development in the Marianas. In this, he had the intelligent cooperation of Vice Admiral William L. Calhoun, Commander Service Force Pacific Fleet, and his subordinates, Commodore W. R. Carter of the Floating Service Force, and Augustine Gray, the Oil King of the Pacific. While the Joint Expeditionary Force was at sea, the Pacific Fleet was being reorganized to accelerate the tempo of the Pacific War. The old South Pacific Command was maintained at Noumea, now a rear base, but Admiral Halsey was placed under Nimitz with the title Commander 3rd Fleet, in the same echelon as Admiral Spruance. Thus, the Pacific Fleet Command was divided into two teams, the first Spruance's and the second Halsey's. One would plan and train while the other fought, reducing time between operations. Vice Admiral Mitcher's Fast Carrier Force, designated Task Force 58 when under Spruance's command, and Task Force 38 when under Halsey's, operated almost continuously, together with most of the gunfire support ships. As Admiral Nimitz put it, the team remains about the same, but the drivers change. To invade Saipan was the greatest challenge that the Allies had yet thrown at Japan. She regarded that island as part of her homeland, as well as a link in her inner defence perimeter. Yet, owing to the newly won command of the sea by the Pacific Fleet, Japan was unable to reinforce Saipan after April 1944. General Saito, the army commander, had only 22,700 troops under him when the Americans landed. Admiral Nagumo, who had lost his carriers at Midway, was also on Saipan in command of a small craft fleet and about 6,700 sailors. We have Pacific Fleet submarines to thank for Saito's lack of reinforcement. One Japanese regiment lost all its weapons and ammunition, and most of its men when several ships of the convoy lifting it to Saipan were sunk by shark, pintado, and pilotfish. From 11 June, Admiral Mitcher's 4 fast carrier groups carried the ball with heavy bombing attacks on the Marianas airfields. 7 new battleships under Admiral Lee's command were detached from Mitcher's Task Force 58 on 13 June to bombard Saipan. But this shore bombardment was a failure. The new battle wagons simply did not know how to do it. Next day, the old Pearl Harbor survivors did much better, and under their cover the underwater demolition teams of frogmen charted channels through the lagoon that bordered the beaches on the leeward coast of Saipan. There were no boat mines or other obstacles such as those that did so much damage on the Omaha beaches in Normandy, the reason being that the Japanese never expected to defend anything, only to conquer, so they were not prepared with defensive material other than coast defence guns. We have now reached Saipan D-Day, 15 June. At 5:42 a.m., Admiral Turner made the signal, "Land the landing force." Chaplains offered a last prayer and a blessing over loudspeakers. Amphtrax laden with troops, taken on board at Eniwetok, poured from the moors of the landing ship's tank. From the big transports, other Marines crawled down landing nets into boats. Those who gazed at the shoreline through binoculars could see a narrow beach backed by sandy soil and low, scrubby trees, with an occasional palm grove or flame tree blooming with vermilion flowers. The land rose in a series of low escarpments like steps, and Mount Tapochau dominated the scene. It was not in the least like anything the Marines had assaulted before. The landings took place on a 2-division front on 8 beaches, almost 4 miles long. The line of departure was established 4,000 yards offshore, and 1,500 yards to seaward were stationed 64 landing ships, tank with the assault troops. 24 gunboats preceded the initial wave to deliver close 40mm fire support. As the long waves of Amphtrax, each trailing a plume of white spray, raced with their supporters toward the beaches, the fire support battleships, cruisers and destroyers, anchored only 1,250 yards offshore, delivered frontal and enfilading fire on beach defences. And as the Amphtrax began crawling over the barrier reef, 72 planes from escort carriers, including 12 Avengers armed with rockets, came down in vicious, hawk-like swoops to strafe the beaches and the area just behind, the rockets making a sound like the crack of a gigantic whiplash. At 8:44 a.m., the initial wave touched down and at once came under intense fire, but pressed resolutely on. Within 8 minutes, there were troops on every beach, and some were fighting their way across the Charon-Canoa airstrip. As the second wave came in, around 8:57 a.m., amph tracks of the first were beginning to retract, passing through the second, third, and fourth waves with expert helmsmanship. Among these 600 and more landing vehicles, tracked and landing craft, tearing to and fro for the space of 2 hours, there was not a single serious collision. So well had the training centre done its work, and so expertly did Commodore Thies and his 50 control craft direct the movement. Despite all hazards, 8,000 Marines got ashore in the first 20 minutes, and all day long and after dark, landing craft were plying furiously between the transports and the beaches. Little, however, went according to plan after the troops were ashore. The reason for landing on so broad a front was to seize a big enough beachhead to allow deployment. Subsequent waves were to mop up behind the first, dig in for the night, next day capture the airfield and strike Cross Island to Magicienne Bay. Saipan would be in the bag, and the assault on Guam could start. But it did not work out that way. The number one objective line was not reached for 3 days, nor Saipan secured for 3 weeks, and the assault on Guam had to be delayed until 21 July. The main reason for this miscarriage was the skill of Japanese artillery and mortar fire, which prevented amph tracks from fulfilling their assignment to carry troops well inland, and forced most of them to disgorge their passengers near the water's edge. By nightfall, although 20,000 assault troops had been landed, 1/10 of them were casualties, and only half of the planned beachhead had been occupied. Unhappy hours lay ahead for the Marines. There is something particularly terrifying about the first night on a hostile beach, when you are the underdog. The Japanese saw to it that nobody slept for more than a few minutes. After a series of probes, their big effort was announced at 3 a.m. June 16 by a bugler, and with much screaming, brandishing of swords and flapping of flags, the enemy launched an attack that was supposed to drive the Marines into the sea. As the Japanese fell, others replaced them, and the fighting on this flank did not reach its climax until sunrise, at 5:45 a.m. 5th Marine Corps tanks then stopped the last attack, and the Japanese withdrew under a blanket of gunfire from cruiser Louisville and destroyers Phelps and Monson, leaving about 700 dead on the battlefield. Dawn came none too soon for the Marines, but it found them still there. This was General Saito's last chance to destroy the enemy at the beachhead, but he was far from downhearted, since he had been assured that an irresistible fleet was about to bring him succour. Unfortunately for him, 5th Fleet had the same warning. On D-Day, Admiral Spruance received word from submarine flying fish that a Japanese carrier force was heading in his direction from San Bernardino Strait, and at 4 a.m. June 16 he received submarine Seahorse's contact report on a second Japanese force, steaming north off Surigao Strait. Rightly assuming that these ships meant business, Spruance promptly cancelled the 18 June date for landing on Guam and went on board Turner's flagship to confer with him and General Holland Smith. There the decision was made to commit at once the reserve, the 27th Infantry Division, to Saipan, to detach certain cruisers and destroyers from the fire support ships to augment the fast carrier's screen, to continue unloading until dark 17 June, and then to send the transports safely eastward until the anticipated naval battle was over. While the forces under Nimitz, Halsey and MacArthur were advancing in the central, south and southwest Pacific, the Japanese combined fleet was swinging around the Hook, either in Truk Lagoon or at Linga Roads off Singapore, or in the inland sea of Japan. The explanation of this inactivity lay in America's vastly increased air power, while Japan was in the sad position of having a carrier fleet with no planes, having sacrificed them in the fruitless defence of Rabaul.